Chess lessons. Going to look at some of the games you've sent me. We're going to divide the analysis into two parts, the positional and the tactical. For the tactical problems, you probably know the themes already, so it'll be specific examples of tactical play. The positional ideas, you may not be aware of many of the themes, so they'll have to be explained more carefully. In fact, the main body of this tape will be positional because tactical themes, tactical ideas are usually easier to learn. Now, let's start with the first game, which began as a reload Pez. White went e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5, a6, bishop to a4, black knight to f6, white castles, black bishop to e7, and now black is threatening to actually win white's pawn, since he's threatening b5 and knight takes e4. So white defends his pawn by rook e1. Black plays b5, bishop to b3. And here black castled. Now at this point, white played the move pawn to d4. And you may like to turn off and decide how black should play in this position. Well, the move black played was pawn takes on d4, and white played knight takes d4. Now there's a tactical disadvantage in this move. I wonder if you can see it. Yeah, the problem here is that white seems to lose a piece because of knight takes d4, queen takes d4, black pawn to c5, hitting the queen, and then black will move on pawn to c4. This has been the disadvantage of white moving his bishop around the queen side and allowing the black pawns to expand. White needs to watch out for this sort of expansion of the c-pawn, trapping the white bishop at b3. In fact, this is called Noah's Ark trap. It's a very old trap, and you fell into it, except your opponent didn't carry it out. After you played knight takes d4, he didn't in fact play knight takes d4. So let's return some of the pieces. You should go back to the diagram, position of diagram 1. Now, after white's d4 and black plays e takes d4, we've decided that white can't recapture. He could play the move pawn to c3, gambiting a pawn and also ensuring that his bishop would have an outlet. And there's a more aggressive move here, I think, and this is pawn to e5. Now the black knight can't go forward, and it has to go back to e8. And now, do you think white can capture the pawn? Well, white can capture, because after knight takes d4 and black plays knight takes d4, white plays queen takes d4 and black plays pawn to c5, white can move his attacked queen to e4, attacking the rook on a8. So he would manage then to get time to save his bishop at b3. Now, besides capturing on d4, I think also white could play bishop to d5, pinning the knight at c6, and then next move he could play knight takes d4. Now, returning again to diagram 1, after white plays pawn to d4, I wonder if in fact black pawn takes d4 is the right move, in view of our reply. Possibly better is for black to play knight takes d4. Now let's see, if white plays now knight takes e5, black could at least gain the two bishop advantage by playing knight takes on b3. Now, instead of knight takes e5, white can play knight takes d4. Black plays pawn takes d4. Again, white mustn't take back yet, but white can play again pawn to e5. Knight goes back to e8, and white plays queen takes d4. And he's ready to move his queen to e4 if black plays the move pawn to c5. So back to diagram 1. And it looks like from our analysis the move pawn to d4 as you played was a good idea as long as it was followed up correctly. Now it wasn't. Black played pawn takes d4, white played knight takes d4, which should have lost a piece, but black now played knight to e5, not winning. Now I wonder how white should play here. I want to suggest the positional idea here of the mobile pawn center. Having eliminated black's pawn at e5, you should consider now advancing your other pawns, that is your f-pawn up to f4, to gain more control of the center. Now this idea is often very useful for, in the first place, gaining space, and secondly, which is related, for driving away the opponent's pieces, particularly his minor pieces, from central positions. Now its disadvantage is that it can leave you open to counterattack. The reason for this is that you control more advanced squares with your pawns, but the squares behind the pawns, say on the third rank in particular, even the second, are not defended now by pawns, and they need to be guarded by pieces, and this may stretch the capacity of the pieces. Obviously, if you have to guard a square with a piece, it's less strongly fortified than if it would be guarded with if it were a pawn that was guarding it. So advantages like that have to be weighed against their possible disadvantages. Still, in this case, let's see what we gain if we play pawn to f4. We play pawn to f4, the knight has to go back. If it goes to g4, we'll just attack it again with h3. Playing f4 opens the diagonal to one's king, white king on g1, and this white must be careful of black playing something like bishop c5 at some point. Now let's see where the knight will go. If it goes back to g6, white can then hit the other knight with pawn to e5, and this will have to go back to base, and it looks like white can even continue with maybe pawn to f5, and the black knight on g6 is in a really terrible position. So let's replace those pieces, have the white's pawns on f4 and e4, black knights on f6 and e5. So here the mobile pawn center seems to be working very well. The alternatives for black to play either knight to c6 or knight to c4. Now possibly knight to c4 is a good idea, but white can still continue with pawn to e5, black plays knight to d5, and in this case white could probably play knight takes b5 because he discovers an attack upon the knight at d5. That looks quite useful. So in this case too, white seems to be driving the black pieces back. Returning again, having the black knights on f6 and e5, and the white pawns on f4 and e4, white knight on d4, and black could move his knight from e5 back to c6. Now in this case white can continue again with pawn to e5, because if black plays bishop c5, white could play probably pawn to c3, or white could even double black's pawns by playing knight takes c6, and then he would have the better shaped pawns in the center. So in this case the mobile pawn center seemed to work, and returning to diagram 1, after white plays, as we've seen, d4, black takes, white knight takes d4, black knight to e5, and white plays pawn to f4, we should note that tactically black can't answer pawn to c5 because white doesn't meekly move his knight away, allowing pawn to c4. He just takes the black knight on e5, and then he's threatening the other knight on f6. So tactically, pawn to f4 seems to work as well. Now, let's return again to this position where black has his knight on e5, white his knight on d4. So white didn't play here pawn to f4. He played pawn to c3 more cautiously. Black went bishop c5, and white played bishop to g5. Now this pin could be effective if white can continue with pawn to f4 and then follow up by pawn to e5. It does get a piece out. Disadvantage is that the bishop may get out of play on g5. Still, bishop to g5 looks like a good move. Black played pawn to h6, bishop came to h4. Black played bishop to b7. Now we see here the effect of black having developed faster now. He's brought both his bishops out. And if white now wishes to play up his pawn center, pawn to f4, then we do get some disadvantages. In particular, black is able to move his knight to g6, and he can attack the exposed bishop on h4. This shows that development does have its disadvantages. A piece which is developed in an advanced position, as is the white bishop at h4, is subject to attack. Now usually it's going to be subject to attack by pawns, but black probably won't want to play pawn to g5 because it would expose his king. But in this case, the attack on the bishop on h4 gains black an important tempo, and in fact white couldn't retreat his bishop without losing his pawn at e4. So pawn to f4 in this position doesn't look right, so we'll put white's pawn back on f2, black's knight on e5. Now white played instead a good developing move, knight to d2, defending e4 and also now threatening pawn to f4. So black logically put pressure along the e-file with rook to e8. Again we have the same question for white. Can he risk the advance of the mobile pawn center? In the first case we looked at, it was clear that the advance would work because black had very little central control and his pieces would be driven back. Now in this case, if white plays pawn to f4, again black can probably gain a tempo. He could play possibly knight to d3. Seems to be forking various pieces. White would have to play rook to f1 to guard his f-pawn. Now it's not so clear, this position. White is threatening pawn to e5 to possibly win the knight on f6, though black is threatening to play knight takes on b2. Now, after white's pawn to f4, let's have black's knight back onto e5, white's rook on e1, and we'll play white pawn to f4. We once again get more counterplay by black. Once again, if black plays knight to c6, he's putting pressure on white's knight at d4. Or if he plays knight to g6, this again unleashes several attacks, one on the f-pawn, one on the bishop, one on the white pawn at e4. So white's advance here has a lot of commitment in it. So f4 doesn't look to be quite right. So this latent idea of using our pawn center has, as we can see, the disadvantage when the opponent is very well developed and has got very strong counter-attacking lines for its pieces. So white here chose the quieter course. This is if with white's pawn back on f2 and the black knight on e5, white chose the quieter course of moving his bishop to c2. And here I think this position is not bad for black because all his minor pieces have come out, and though his knight at e5 looks to be exposed to f4. As we've seen, there are many disadvantages in making that move. So black's got an active position now. Now after bishop c2, black played pawn to d6. That's again a good defensive move, because if white plays pawn to f4, next thing white will want to do is to play pawn to e5. So after pawn to d6, white was here in some dilemma. Question is, shall we play pawn to f4 or not? Well, what did you think? Well, in my opinion, I think white had to play this move, even though it is committal. After pawn to f4, black plays knight to g6, forking the pawn and the bishop. White must play bishop to g3. However, in this position, though white is under fire on e4 and f4, he is in fact controlling and holding those squares. So there are then later going to be threats of white playing pawn to e5 and pawn to e6 or pawn to f5. Probably white will have to safeguard his king by playing king to h1 to get out of the pin of the bishop at c5. But later white must try and advance with pawn to e5. Possibly white even has to play the queen up to f3, even though it puts it in a pin against the bishop at b7, and then play rook to d1. And then he'd later have to move the queen away, or possibly play moves like pawn to h3, just holding the space advantage. White needs to advance eventually pawn to e5 and then pawn to e6, but he isn't totally mobilized yet, and probably having gained this space, he needs to hold it and later on advance. Anyway, I feel that white should have obtained his mobile pawn center, but not with the idea of immediately and rapidly advancing forward, but just to gain space and hold it for a period of time and later advance. Now in the actual game, instead of playing pawn to f4, so white's bishop's on h4, white's pawn's on f2, and the black knight is on e5, white played the knight from d2 to f3, and black played knight to g6. Now the implications of this move are that the knight attacks the bishop on h4, and also the pawn at e4 is now 3 times attacked. So white's got no alternative really except to play bishop takes f6. Now after queen takes f6, black has the advantage. The reason being that black has been able to force white to exchange a bishop for a knight, and also it's white's better bishop, because the other bishop on c2 is slightly restricted by its own pawn at e4. So the black squares are quite strong for black. The squares f4, e5, even c5. Also black's queen has come to an active position on f6. So here we get a sort of shift of value away from what was previously a slight advantage to white, and probably white could have maintained this slight advantage by playing pawn to f4, to what is now a slight advantage to black because of this 2 bishop plus and active pieces. White is now under siege, so let's see how white defends this position. White here played knight to f5. Black moved rook a8 to d8. This is a good move, bringing the rook into action, and there's also a threat of d5 by black. Now white played the knight round to g3, and here black played knight to e5. Now I didn't really like that move. I preferred black playing knight to f4 because the knight seems more active there. It doesn't block the action of the rook at e8. The other move which seems quite strong is for black to play pawn to d5, opening up the center. If White plays pawn takes d5, black would play rook takes e1 check. White would have to recapture with the queen. And then black would play bishop takes d5. And, well then actually white could play rook to d1, so he'd be building a sort of counterattack by the pin on the bishop at d5, but no, this isn't so good. Black would just play bishop takes f3 and double white's pawn. So d5 looked good for black, or knight f4. So let's return to the game, and black has just played knight to e5. As I said, I didn't like it. Black's got rooks on d8 and e8, pawn on d6, bishops on c5 and b7, queen on f6, queen on d1, rook on e1, knights on g3, f3, pawn on e4, bishop on c2. Now, after black knight to e5, white avoided exchange. He went knight to d4. Black now moved knight to c6. A lot of wandering around here. White knight from g3 went into f5. Well, black hasn't been making progress over the last two moves. He hasn't taken advantage of his position. In fact, his knight maneuver from g6 to c6 was pretty pointless. It was much better on g6 because at least it didn't block the bishop at b7. So now black, I suppose the best thing he can do is move his knight around back to e7 again and start again with the ideas we suggested of possibly bringing the knight into f4, where it has sort of a strong outpost and threatens the white position. Of course, the knight on f4, even though it's exposed to white playing pawn to g3 to drive it away, white will have to think twice about this because of the resultant exposure of his king. The knight might come into h3 check, for example. So a knight on f4 like this is always a dangerous thing. The other suggestion was to play pawn to d5 and open up the position in the center against white, and try to open up the position especially for the black bishops. Now, in this position, black, still having lost the thread of the game, played the move queen to g6. You might like to turn off and decide what you'd play as white here. Now we're getting to a tactical stage of the game because black has allowed white a tactical opportunity of playing the move pawn to e5. Now normally this would lose a pawn, but white has this threat of knight to e7 with a discovery against the black queen. Now this threat is tremendously powerful, and it's more so because black hasn't got many escapes for his queen. If he tries, say, queen to g5, then white could play pawn to h4, black plays queen to f4, and now just pawn to g3, and the black queen has been trapped. So an immediate pawn to e5 looked tremendously strong. Now let's return to diagram 2, where white actually misses this opportunity of playing pawn to e5 and plays instead queen to d2, and black now played d5. Well, black's at the moment playing positionally, but there's a tactical disaster coming up. White played e takes d5, black rook takes e1, white rook takes e1. Now black continued blithely with knight takes on d4. And of course no prizes for the next move. Knight to e7 check. Black bishop takes e7. White bishop takes g6. White's won a queen. Black f takes g6. White queen took on d4. It could have taken on at e7 as well. That looked strong. Still, queen takes d4 looks okay. Black played rook takes d5. I'd like you to stop and study this position for a little. Well, this sort of development shows the importance of tactical play. The tactics may only occur, say, in one move out of 20 on the board, but they do have this tremendous ability to change the outcome of position. This is why, well, often masters differ from the weaker players, that they're able to see tactics in the position and not allow them to happen. And this is often why a master game is consistent all the way through. You only get a slight advantage or a slight disadvantage, and possibly it may eventually end up in a draw. That's because they spot the tactics before they come, but the weaker players don't have this tactical control, and therefore quite suddenly the game can change out of all proportion. And whereas you might have had a slight advantage or disadvantage, now you're talking in terms of actual material losses. And here white has got an enormous advantage in material. There's a queen against two bishops. Bishops may be worth 6 or 7, queen is worth about 9 points. So white should be easily able to win this game on material. Now, perhaps the quickest way to win these sort of games is to look out for chances to simplify into what would be a clearly won endgame. Now, in this position, white has got this possibility. White can play the move, queen takes d5, black bishop takes d5, and white rook takes on e7. Now, in exchange-up endings, the bishop is usually no match for the rook, unless it can possibly set up some barricade to stop the rook coming in. Now, here, black will probably play pawn to c6 to give his bishop a strong post at d5. White would play rook a7, black would play bishop takes a2, white would play rook takes a6. Now, what would white do? White would then probably move his rook down to a7 to keep the black king locked in, then play moves like f3 and move his king over to the white king to f2 to e3 to d4. And black has got to try and keep his position with his bishop at d5 and pawn at c6 as a sort of anchoring point. As soon as he moves his pawns up on the queen side, his bishop loses anchoring points and becomes exposed as well as the pawns. But the mutual defense of bishop at d5 and pawn at c6 is a fairly strong sort of defensive situation. Now, if you set up a position where the white rook, say, is at a7, black bishop at c6, and black bishop at d5 and black pawn at c6, white's plan would be to move pawn to f3 and then move his king over to c5. Meanwhile, the black king is tied down to defending the kingside pawns. Now, next thing that white will do is probably to sacrifice his rook for either the pawn at c6 or the bishop at d5. It doesn't matter which. And then he will gain a 2-to-1 advantage on the king's side. Well, he'll probably pick up all black's pawns on the queen's side, and just push the queenside pawns through. So this is the sort of winning method. It's a matter of technique, which often beginners, weaker players don't have. They don't often get into these situations, and when they do, they haven't. No one's told them how to win them. But this is basically the idea. You bring your king up with the rook, and at the right moment, if you're the exchange up, you probably exchange your rook for the bishop and gain an extra couple of pawns, and then what you get is a winning king and pawn ending. That's if you haven't made any other inroads with your king and rook, because the rook anyway is an intrinsically superior piece to the bishop, so you might be able to make some other advantages with it. Now let's return to the position of diagram 3, and actually we can improve this a little bit, white's chances in the endgame a little bit, I think. Instead of playing queen takes d5, if we just play rook takes e7 straight away, black will play rook takes d4, white plays pawn takes d4. Now the result here is that white's going to get the pawn at c7, and he'll also have a passed d pawn, so this is a much even easier win than the last one, because black isn't going to be able to get any anchor point for his bishop in the center. Now, from diagram 3, besides winning by liquidation, as we've shown, white also could have found the crushing tactical move queen to a7, winning one of the bishops. Instead, white retained the queen by moving it back to e3, a more passive spot. Now, black really hasn't got enough counterplay in this situation, even though the two bishops can be annoying, but he can cause some trouble. There's possibility if the white rook leaves the back rank of a back rank mate. There's a possibility of attacks by the bishops lining up against f2 and g2, so white's got to be careful here. But the important thing is white can allow certain exchanges. White can allow, say, black to capture on f2 with his rook and his bishop, say, exchanging his queen for the rook and bishop, and perhaps even losing another pawn, as long as he retains this winning advantage in the endgame of an exchange up. Now, in that case, white should at least be able to win. Now let's see how white actually managed to lose this position. After queen e3, black played bishop c5. Now white has to decide whether to go back onto the defensive to defend his f2 and g2 squares, or whether he can make an attack on the black king. Now I think it is possible to make an attack on the black king, and same, say, attacking the weak spot in black's position, if you can find one, and also making sure that you don't get back rank mated. But you should be able, as you have the superior forces, there should be possibilities of bringing your queen and rook into action against, say, some weak spot in the black position. So decide how you'd answer black's bishop c5. Now I think the aggressive way of answering bishop c5 is to play queen e8 check, black king to h7, and now pawn to h4. This stops black playing rook to g5. And now, if black plays, say, rook to d2, or rook to f5, then white can play the rook in to e6. So let's say if black plays rook to d2. White plays rook e6. Now, if black plays bishop takes f2 check, white will play king to h2, and will be threatening queen takes g6 check. This combined attack against the g6 square may force black to back down. Now, however, instead of bishop takes f2 check, black has better in playing rook down to d1 check, white king to h2, now bishop to d6 check, because if white now plays pawn to g3, black will just move rook to h1 mate. So white must take steps against this sort of counterattack. Actually, we might have to refine our analysis a little bit here to make sure we don't give black so much counterplay. Let's return to diagram 3, and this is after white plays queen to e3 and black plays bishop c5. If we still give the check on e8, black plays king h7. Now if we play, say, pawn to b4 first, the black bishop has to go back to b6, and now we can play pawn to h4. Stops rook to g5. Black comes in rook to d2, and again we now have rook to e6. And now here, if black plays rook e1 check, king h2, there isn't any follow-up check on d6 by black bishop to d6, so white's attack on the g6 square looks much stronger. So this is a fairly blunt and clumsy attack, but it was based on the underlying principle that white should be able to get some attack as he's got superior forces, and we found a weak spot in black's position and attacked it. Now, in fact, white from diagram 3, after queen e3, black bishop c5, white in fact played queen e6 check, not quite so good. Black played king h7, and now white played king to f1. This was rather futile as well, possibly, I think, pawn to h3. Or maybe we should again drive the bishop back with pawn to b4, black bishop to b6, and then pawn to h3, or maybe pawn to h4 again. We can't get our attack going, but at least if black plays rook f5, we can play rook e2 and defend the f2 square that way. Same applies if black plays rook down to d2. Still, black's got a certain amount of counterplay here. Now, in fact, white played king f1 instead of b4 or h4. King f1, black played rook f5. White now played pawn to f3, and black played bishop to d5. Now the bishop's getting very active. It's threatening to come into c4 check. White played queen e8. Black played bishop to f7. White went queen e4. Black played bishop to d5. Now, in this position, white had to move his queen possibly back to e8. Instead, she played queen to c2. Now, this was disadvantageous because after bishop c4 check, rook e2, black now played rook to e5. And this is the one position that white mustn't allow, because what's going to happen is that black's going to get the rook and queen against the rook and the bishop. White can allow to exchange his queen for rook and bishop, but not to lose his rook as well. So in fact, what's going to happen is that white loses on material, because he's going to be a piece down. Well, as far as I can see, white had to take the draw earlier by moving the queen back and forth from e4 to e8, and losing control of the e5 square allowed black to get his rook to e5 and thus win the ending. Well, there isn't much to say after the piece is lost. Black just, with an extra piece, had a fairly easy win. To wind up this side of the tape, I'd like to immortalize a little game I discovered in Horowitz's Solitaire Chess. It was played in 1939 between Plecci and Enzelins. I'm sure you've never heard of either of them, but the game is certainly worth remembering. Now, this one began e4, e6, d4, d5. Now white played knight to d2, the Tarrasch variation of the French defense, which is very popular with the world champion Karpov, mainly because you maintain the tension in the center, maintain the pawns at e4 and d5, and yet at the same time you don't give black the opportunity of pinning your knight with bishop to b4. Now, against this, black played pawn to c5, attacking in the center, because the pressure on his own d pawn is not so strong, certainly not as strong as it would be if there was a white knight on c3, and black therefore thinks he should take over the center, especially as white has blocked his own pieces. So black plays pawn to c5, white brings his knight from from g1 to f3, and black here exchanged pawn takes on e4. White played knight takes on e4. Now, quite probably, black should exchange on d4. Instead, he chose to hold his pawn by playing knight from b8 to d7, defending the pawn at c5, and white played pawn takes c5. black now played knight takes c5. Now here black is allowing his king to be dislodged, and he's going to lose castling rights. But he thinks that because there aren't queens on the board, his king will be fairly safe. Well, in fact, white manages to develop his pieces very rapidly in an attack against the black king, even though there are queens off. And we'll see that black's king does get into danger nonetheless. It's a difficult problem often to decide when the endgame comes, that is, at what stage your king is safe and can go into the center. But it isn't really such a straightforward thing as saying, well, if the queens are off, the endgame is here. White now played queen takes d8 check, black king takes on d8. And now white got a few free developing moves. He played bishop to g5 check. Black played pawn to f6. Now white developed again. Castles queenside check. Black king to e8. White now played bishop to b5 check. Black king to f7. Now it's your move as white here. You happen to have two pieces en prise, so I think you should remember that. Turn off the tape and decide how you would play in this position. Well, the move white played was rook to d8, and he's pinning the black pieces all along the back rank. Now the first thing you have to see is whether you have answers to black playing pawn takes bishop. Well, this one is quite easy because you play knight to e5 check, and then if king to e7 you play rook to e8 mate. Now put white's knight back on f3, black pawn on f6, white bishop at g5, white rook at d8, and a black king at f7. Looks more complicated if black plays knight takes knight on e4. Then white plays knight to e5 check, and here black can't take the knight because white would then play bishop e8 mate. So he'd have to play king to e7, white rook to e8 check, black king to d6. Now I'm not quite sure what the best continuation for white here is. Possibly white can play knight to f7 check, king c5, and now bishop to e3 check, king takes bishop, and now maybe rook takes on f8, and white should end up the exchange ahead at least. Now return your pieces to the position after white played rook d8. You'll find that's diagram A in the booklet. Now black didn't play any of these moves, and he played a good defense, bishop to e7. Now I wonder if you can find a way for white to continue in this situation. Now you haven't just got two pieces en prise, you've got three. Knight on e4, bishop at g5, and rook at d8. Well, if you played bishop e8 check, it's not made, and then he moved his king back to f8, and then you discovered check. That doesn't win because your rook's en prise. Really there seems to be only one way to win, that's to sacrifice more pieces. So you play knight to e5 check. This is from diagram A, after black plays bishop e7. Pawn takes knight, and now the point, knight to d6 check. And this is really superb, this move, because if black plays bishop takes knight, now white does get his mate in two by bishop to e8 check, king back to f8, and then bishop to h5, discovered checkmate. So let's go back to diagram A. After white plays knight e5 check. Sorry, black plays bishop e7, white knight e5 check. Pawn takes knight, and then knight d6 check. Of course, black can here move his king out to g6. And then you just play prosaically. After having gone for the mate, you're quite happy to take extra material. You play bishop takes e7. And after black replies knight takes e7, white plays rook takes rook. And with his extra material, and black still being tied down, white will win this game quite easily. The amateur game, side 2. Here black is facing an unusual opening, the bird's opening, but it's not so unusual if we consider that white is playing at black defense. So white's moves look very passive and quiet, but if one looks at them from the point of view as that they are black moves instead, then they become quite sensible. And it doesn't matter if black plays fairly passive moves early on, if later on he does have some concrete plan of attack. In this case, the plan of attack was on the king side, and white managed to get this going and in fact establish a good position. Now looking at the Dutch defense, let's have a look at a few moves of the Dutch defense and see how that comes about. Say white would go d4, black f5, c4, black knight f6. This is the Dutch defense, the pawn on f5. White now, say knight c3, pawn to e6 by black, pawn to g3 by white, black bishop to e7, white bishop to g2. Now black's bishop at c8 is pretty well incarcerated, and the white bishop at g2 prevents it coming out at b7. In this position, black castles, white knight f3, black pawn to d6, that's the only way to get his bishop out. White castles, Now black could continue possibly knight c6. It depends if white's pawn d5 is any good. Or black can continue queen e8. And then if white plays knight b5, black could play bishop back to d8 to defend the c7 pawn. Or black could try and restrain white's advances on the queen side by playing pawn to a5. This would stop white from playing pawn to b4. Now basically black has got slight superiority on the king's side because he has a pawn at f5. This gives him the space advantage on that side of the board. So black is going to try and get some attack going on that side. That's why he'd move his queen to e8, to h5, possibly h6 and g5. And he'll bring his knight to c3 or to d7. The other idea for black is to play in the center, to try and get in the move pawn to e5 himself. It's not possible yet, but it could be, say, if black got his knight to c6. So that shows us how the Dutch defense comes about. Now let's have a look at the opening in our game. White began f4. Black pawn went to e6. White played knight f3. Black went pawn to b6. So black's going to play a fianchetto defense, getting his bishop on a nice diagonal, and not occupy the center by pawn to d5 yet. But since white isn't occupying it, then black isn't going to be prevented from doing so later on. So b6, white pawn to e3, bishop b7, bishop e2, black knight came to f6, white played pawn to d3. You see these quiet moves, which are the Dutch defense. Black played pawn to c5, and white castled. Black played bishop e7. Now we get white's first attacking idea, queen to e1. Doesn't look very attacking, but he wants to play later h3 and g4. He can't actually play it to h4 because of possible discoveries. Well, probably wouldn't be too good on h4 because of these discoveries. But eventually it wants to have some work on the king's side, and this space advantage that black's got with his pieces and his pawn, especially on white's got pieces and pawn on f4, give him this chance of expansion on the king's side, even though his own king is on that side. Now, black played knight c6. After queen e1, black played castles. Now white played pawn to a4. Again, doesn't look to have much point, but it doesn't harm white's position. It does prevent black's expansion on the queen's side. Black played knight c6. And here, possibly white was afraid of knight b4, though it isn't such a dangerous threat. But white played bishop to d1. And this move both defends the c2 pawn and threatens to move the pawn up to e4 and possibly to e5 with a bit of support from the queen at the back. Now black played queen c7. Black is also just developing his pieces to sensible squares. Now black's play must be down the central files. He hasn't done anything with his kingside pawns. So queen c7. Now white begins pawn to h3, beginning his advance. Black plays pawn to d5 here, and white developed a piece knight to c3. Now if black wants to take the initiative in this position, he must consider the advances of his central pawns, either in order to open lines, of course, with queens and rooks. So either pawn to e5, pawn to d4, or pawn to c4. These are the three possibilities, and we'll have to see which of these he should really aim for. Now, the thing to know about opening files is if one puts pawns into contact with each other, and in this position they aren't yet, if one does, that doesn't necessarily mean one will get one's open file, because the opponent can refuse to exchange the pawns, or he can also say, push his pawn past your pawn. Or he may exchange the pawns and open up the wrong file for you. So line opening is quite a complicated process. Now here, if black played pawn to d4, I think this would succeed in opening a file because it's hitting the knight at c3 and the pawn at e3. So it looks like a file should be opened in the center, and this is what black wants because he has got the superiority in the center. And also moving down pawn to d4 will help to open the line of his bishop at b7. Now the trouble is black has a queen at c7, so white is able not to accept the offer. White can play knight to b5, hitting the queen. Queen, let's say, goes back to d8. Now white doesn't exchange because if he exchanges, pawn takes d4 and black plays pawn takes d4. Now white's pawn at d4 is looking a bit weak, but at the same time the pawn at c2 would look to be backward. Or if white exchanges pawn takes d4, black could put in pawn to a6 first, driving the white knight away, and then play pawn takes on d4 or knight takes on d4 himself. And this should ensure that he doesn't suffer too much with a slightly weak d pawn. But if he can hold that pawn at d4, then his he will have pressure down the adjacent file, which is the c file. Now after pawn to d4, so white doesn't take the pawn, white moves his pawn up to e4, and this then gives white the central superiority, 2 pawns abreast in the center, and even white could play later pawn to g4, and the 3 pawns coming up, especially against the black king, is a bit worrying. White's knight on b5, if it's pushed back, can go back to a3, where it does a useful job, stopping black coming in with pawn to c4. So here pawn to d4 would be a good idea, except it doesn't work because of white's knight b5. Now returning to diagram 4, another line opening move is pawn to c4. Now possibly white has got several choices here, none of which seem too bad. In the one thing, the pawn moving to c4 releases control of the d4 square, so white could try the maneuver knight b5 to d4. White could also consider playing pawn to d4 himself, which blocks the position up, and it makes his bishop at d2 worse. It makes his square e4 weak. But on the other hand, it leaves the black bishop at b7 also incarcerated, and it also possibly gives white a square for his knight on e5, a strongly supported square. The third possibility against black's pawn to c4 is for white to play pawn takes c4, black pawn takes c4, and then pawn to e4, again trying to get some central advantage. So black would have some play here by bishop c5 check and knight to d4, and he'd have some play on the open d file as well. So pawn to c4 at this stage doesn't seem to lead to good structures for black. And the other pawn break is the possibility pawn to e5. Now this looks quite promising because if white plays pawn to f5, then black's 3 pawns in the center look very powerful, and he should have chances of either playing pawn to pawn to e4 or pawn to d4 at some point. The other thing is that if white exchanges, then the e file will become open, and the white pawn at e3 would become a little backward pawn, because black will be able to put a rook on the e file and put pressure on it. Now this pawn is defended by the bishop at d2, or wherever it is at the moment, maybe it's at c1. But still, the bishop is tied to the defense of the pawn and therefore can't take up other more active duties. So Pawn to e5 looks one of the most promising ways for black to play. If he's going to play this way, though, you must realize that he'll be giving white an open f-file, and also that he might as well have use of his open e-file, so he ought to put his rook on the e-file soon. Now, in the position of diagram 4, black played his pawn to a6, preventing white from playing knight to d5, and therefore black does have this threat of pawn to d4 now. It looks like it's some threat. So white moved his knight to e2, which also ties in with white's idea of transferring his pieces for a kingside attack. So knight e2 is a good move, and black played rook a d8, still presumably trying to play the pawn d4 move, but this move, as we've mentioned, may not be so good because white isn't necessarily forced to exchange. White can move his pawn up from e3 to e4, and then white would have the superiority. So even though this is quite a good centralizing move for the rook, it may not be quite on target, and maybe a better move would be to play rook to e8, because then black would be able to later play bishop to f8 and pawn to e5, getting another pawn up onto the fourth rank and offering to open the e-file. So rook a d8, perhaps not the sharpest move. Now white, I should think here, might as well play his pawn up to g4. It's important to often develop pieces behind pawns. This is what the players in fact have been doing. As you can see, every piece in the position is developed behind a pawn, except in one case, the black knight on f6. And this is because black doesn't want to push up the pawns in front of his king to expose them. We'll see actually that the knight on f6, because it's developed in front of a pawn, is somewhat exposed, and if white played here pawn to g4, then he would be threatening to gain time and drive the knight away from f6. So virtually any piece which is developed in front of a pawn may be subject to attack, as we will see in this game. Now here white didn't follow this maxim, and he played his knight from e2 to g3, developing it in front of the g-pawn. Now this doesn't lead to the exposure of the knight at g3, particularly, because black has no intention of advancing kingside pawns up, but it does leave white with less attacking prospects. He isn't able to play pawn to g4. So knight g3 doesn't look quite right. Now again, the one good thing about the move is that if black plays pawn e5 here, white would be able to move his knight into an advanced outpost, because pawn advances leave the squares undefended, which were previously defended, and therefore there's a possibility of a knight coming into f5. Now, therefore, I think it's better for black to play first rook fe8, possibly bishop to f8, possibly g6, bishop g7 even, playing fairly slowly, and then finally e5. And then white wouldn't be able to bring his knight into f5, and black would have opened up pressure down the e-file. Now, after white's knight to g3, black played his line opening move. He played pawn to e5, and here white again has got this choice, as one always has in line opening positions: move forward with the pawn, exchange the pawns, or just leave the situation as it is. Now leaving the situation as it is doesn't help white at all. If he allows black to take off the pawn, and then white recaptures e takes f4, then white isn't well placed to contest the e-file. He's got a queen on it, and black would be able to put rooks on the e-file. So white would definitely lose the battle for the e-file, or he'd be behind in that battle. Now the other possibility is for white to push forward with pawn to f5, but this doesn't look very nice because black's got then a set of 3 pawns along the central files, and they're also threatening to become quite mobile. Particularly threatening looks the move pawn to e4. and the knight from f3 is going to be driven back to some inferior square, possibly h2. Oh, and then black has got a very strong move here, bishop to d6. So the knight on g3 has become exposed, but not actually exposed to pawns. It's exposed to this tremendous fire along the diagonal. And white's bishop at c1 has been unable to contest this this attack because of white's pawn on e3. So this is an example of how pawns can hamper the power of pieces. So having played pawn to e5, this is the position after black's pawn e5. So pawn to e5 looks like white must exchange off. Pawn takes e5, which he did do. And then black played knight takes e5. Now let's have a look at this position. Now this position is one where white has this backward pawn at e3. If he tries to push it onto e4, it'll just be exchanged or even lost, and it does hamper therefore development of his whole queen side. On the other hand, white's got the open f-file, and also black has presented white with the outpost at f5, so white moved in knight to f5. And this knight is a very strong piece. We saw in the last game a black knight could have come into f4, and this is virtually an outpost, even though it can be attacked by pawn to g6. This would cause a weakening of the black king side, so black isn't sure whether he wants to play that at all because of the answer knight h6 check. So knight f5 happened. Now possibly black should play rook e8, and then white would have to decide whether to exchange off his knight for the bishop or to leave his knight in its strong outpost. It would be not an easy decision to make. Now instead of this, black played knight e5 takes f3 check, and white played bishop takes f3. And this, I think, is positionally not good because he brought the bishop from d1 into a more active position, exchanged off a well centralized knight. Basically, what has happened is that white's bishop is in a more active post, so black shouldn't really have done that. Now, if we assess the position from our numerical point of view, we see material is completely even, so we're basically talking about positional pluses and minuses. Now let's see, what are the pluses? Well, black has a plus in development because two white pieces haven't come into action, the one on c1 and the one on a1, so that's temporary advantage in development. Black has some advantage in center as well, two pawns advanced against white's slightly more backward pawns, very much more backward pawns. So that's another advantage for black. Also, white's pawn on e3 is backward on an open file. This is a third possible plus for black. Now, the other thing is that white has got an open f-file and a good knight on f5. So the knight on f5 is probably a +1 point, and also the fact that white would be able to get the knight takes the exchange of the knight for the bishop. However, they can't both be a plus point, because either white plays knight takes bishop check, losing his outpost, regaining the two bishops, or he doesn't play knight takes bishop check, but retains his outpost. Now, I want to move on a couple moves further till we get to a position where we can make another assessment, where things have become more clear. Now, after, let's see, white's bishop takes e3, black played his rook to e8, and white chose not to exchange the knight for the bishop, which I think actually he should have done, because after knight takes bishop check, queen takes knight, say queen to h4, though the black bishop at c1 hasn't come out yet, it looks like it would have a future if it goes to d2, and later possibly to c3. It's a moot point. In some ways, the pawn at e3 seems to be a weakness, but probably the two bishops in this open position, especially as also black's bishop at b7 isn't very good. It's blocked by its own pawn, and this pawn doesn't look like it's going to be advancing much further. So I think white could probably have exchanged his knight for the bishop and gained this long-term advantage of the two bishops in a somewhat open position. Now, instead of playing knight takes bishop check, white played queen to f2 to get his queen out of the line of the black rook, and black played bishop to f8 to safeguard his bishop. White now played pawn to g4. Now let's do another assessment of the position. We've established before that black's plus points are his better development, which we can see by his very well centralized rooks, and we compare that to white's rook at a1 and bishop at c1. Also black's greater central control, pawns at c5 and d5. And then there's the pressure against the pawn at e3, which actually black cannot augment particularly. It's just restraining pressure rather than attacking pressure, because the pawn isn't going to be captured in the short run. So there's restraint against the white pawn at e3. So that's three advantages for white. They might all, if you were assessing them, you would probably give white the 3-point advantage, and that's, if there was no compensation for black, this would probably be the equivalent of a pawn advantage. So quite a substantial positional advantage. Now, on the other hand, white's counter advantages are his well-placed knight at f5, which doesn't look as though it can be dislodged too easily. He's got quite a lot of pressure down the f-file, and threats of playing pawn to g4 to g5. He's made this kingside expansion, which looks dangerous, but in fact it isn't particularly, because white has got several pieces on the king's side to defend any weak squares, and therefore it's not so dangerous for white, it's dangerous for black. Then white's threat of pawn to g5 is also to drive the knight to, well, the knight doesn't appear to have a particular post to go to. d7 isn't a very good square at all. So if black is to get any advantage in this position, which his 3 points are counterbalanced by white's 3 points, knight on f5, pressure down the f-file, kingside expansion, so we probably make this position fairly balanced. Black's got to try and make something of his pluses, and probably try to open things in the center. Now if he plays pawn to d4, this doesn't seem much good, because white blocks with pawn to e4. So the only alternative is pawn down to c4, which didn't work in previous occasions, but it might do so here. Now after pawn to c4, exchanging for white is no good. After it, pawn takes c4, pawn takes c4, black will later be able to move his knight into e4 with tremendous pressure. So after pawn to c4, the other move for white, pawn to d4, could be answered again by knight to e4, bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, and here white's bishop on c1 is pretty well incarcerated, and black may in fact be able to play pawn to g6 soon, because knight h6 check could be answered by bishop takes knight. Black has the disadvantage that his bishop at b7 is still blocked by its own pawns, but it's counterbalanced by the suppression of the bishop at c1, so black would have an advantage here. In fact, after bishop takes e4, black would probably even take with the rook to keep pressure down the e-file against the pawn at e3. Now there's a problem though of black playing pawn to c4. This is the position of diagram 5. Now, in diagram 5, after white's pawn to g4, if black plays pawn to c4, white has got the move pawn to g5. And this is pretty awkward for black. He hasn't got any squares for his knight. He'd like to take on d3 and then move the knight into e4, but it doesn't look like he can do that. He has to therefore move his knight back to d7. Now it's a question of what white can make of this position. There are some dangerous ideas in the position. White could play pawn takes c4, black pawn takes c4, then bishop takes b7, black queen takes bishop on b7, knight h6 check, pawn takes knight, queen takes f7 check, but then king to h8. Maybe black is okay here. It's not too clear, that position. Now, as well as that, from diagram 5, black's attempt to utilize his pawn center, which is supposed to be his advantage, by advancing pawn down to c4, as we've seen, can be answered by pawn to g5, black knight d7, then possibly pawn to d4. In this case, black isn't able to bring his knight into e4, and though white's bishop at c1 is bad, then the black bishop at b7 is also bad. But white will probably be able to play bishop to g2, move his bishop to d2, and his rook, say, to e1, and he'll still retain this kingside pressure in the position. Now, therefore, from this point of view, I'm not sure if I like the move pawn to c4. Now, if this is the case and white's threat of pawn to g5 is so strong, we might think that white in fact has the advantage here, though at first sight it certainly doesn't look as though he has, because we've seen white's bad development. He's got less space in the center, he's got a backward pawn, and black's piece is all on good squares, so it looks like. So we should try and look for some continuation for black, which will enable him to gain the advantage, or at least increase the advantage if he has it. Now, one idea is in fact to eliminate the outpost. If this outpost at f5 isn't really an outpost, then one of white's plus points, positional points, in fact disappears. So the possibility here is to play pawn to g6. We said that this could lead to dangers for the black king, though at the present moment knight h6 certainly isn't possible. So maybe white has to move his knight back to g3, and black continue the attack with bishop to d6. And now white would probably play king to g2 to guard the knight. I suppose he could play knight e2. That looks a fairly passive move. Anyway, king to g2. Now black's knight on f6 is a little uneasy, so it could be transferred here to d7. This transference has been checked out that white hasn't got any discoveries with his bishop, which will enable him soon to take the f7 pawn. Now the knight here is utilizing the space advantage, I suppose, and better control of the center, which black has. The pawns at c4, c5 and d5, and also the pressure down the e-file enables black to utilize squares in the center. So he's utilizing this idea that he has more central control and more control of central squares. So he's transferred his knight from f6 to d7, and it will come to e5 and threaten to exchange off for the bishop, and this will gain black a two-bishop advantage and also weaken the defenses of the white king, because there'll be threats along the diagonal leading to the white king. So this maneuver seems quite strong for black. Pawn to g6 to eliminate white's knight outpost, and then to transfer his knight to e5. So, from diagram 5, black plays pawn to g6. It's not clear that white will in fact give up his positional plus point so easily by retreating his knight back to g3. He may try to get something out of it, or at least not leave it so meekly. So possibly he may play queen to h4, threatening the knight at f6, and if black takes on f5, white will take on f6. Black would then be able to check in on g3, and the position is, well, it's a fairly complicated one, I should think. We look again from diagram 5. After g6, queen to h4, black could try, say, rook e6, guarding knight on f6. White could check on h6. Now, black better decide whether to leave the knight out there, but let's say he takes the knight, gets rid of this annoying piece. Bishop takes knight, queen takes check. Sorry, queen takes on h6. Now, here white's got an advantage of two bishops in this position, and therefore black should try and get something quickly to compensate for this. So he plays queen g3 check, bishop to g2, black pawn d4, white pawn to e4. Now black plays knight takes e4, and if pawn takes e4, black could play bishop takes e4, threatening the bishop at g2 with a strong attack for the piece. However, this, if we put black's bishop back on b7, black's knight on e4, white's pawn on d3. After black knight takes e4, white's got no need to take the knight. He can play bishop to f4, suddenly developing his bishop, and in fact winning the black queen. So this analysis seems to show the position has got more resources for white than appears at first sight. And after pawn to g6, white can complicate matters by playing his queen up to h4. So returning to diagram 5, the alternative to g6 is to place a knight d7 and then into e5 to transport the knight to a place where it's less vulnerable, and where of course it will also defend the f7 pawn. Now, in this position, black chose to eliminate the outposted knight by playing bishop to c8, or trying to eliminate it. And here white rather meekly brought the knight back to g3. I think instead white should have played bishop to g2, so if bishop takes knight, then queen takes bishop. And white, what has white got in this position? He's got two bishops, pressure down the f-file. And against that, black has got superior development and the backward pawn at e3. So somewhat balanced chances, though in the long term I prefer white's chances, because he should be able to catch up in development, and I don't see that black can necessarily take advantage of his development plus that easily. And therefore the two bishops and the open f-file should outweigh the black advantages. Now, after black bishop c8, white went knight to g3, so that gets rid of one of white's pluses. And what should we do for black here? It's possibly the line we were thinking of before looks possible. Bishop to d6 here, bishop to d6, king to g2. And then maybe bishop to e6, guarding the f7 pawn, and then the later transference of the knight round to e5. That looks a possible move. And then the knight from e5 could possibly go to g6 and into h4. Or black could plan moves like rook f8 and pawn to f5. So there could be quite a long maneuvering battle, but black would seem to have the plus here, because white hasn't got really any pluses. Well, white's got the plus of some kingside expansion, but he's already sort of given that back by retreating the knight to g3. So it's not a very aggressive way to play. Now after knight to g3, black didn't continue very well. I don't think he played rook to e6, possibly planning to double on the e file, but the open file isn't too useful for black in the sense that he'll be able to take the pawn at e3, because it's guarded by a bishop, and even if you attack it with two rooks and a queen, you won't be able to take it without a sacrifice. So open files can be ineffective from some points of view. It is still useful to have the rook on an open file, because it's restraining the pawn coming up to e5, and also controls several squares in the center. But rook e6 doesn't seem to be the right way to continue here. White at last began development, bishop to d2. Black went rook to c6, another puzzling move, but probably better off here than on e6, where it blocks the bishop at c8. Now, how would you play as white in this position? Well, white here played pawn to c4. I think possibly pawn to g5 would have been best. The knight would then have to go back to e8, otherwise the d pawn goes. Then white can continue pawn to h4, continuing his kingside advance. And instead white played the move pawn to c4, which is an interesting move because he's taking advantage of the pin on the pawn at d5. However, on the other hand, he's opening up the position, or threatening to open it up, in the center, which is an area where he's very weak, so he shouldn't try to do that unless he can get very clear gains. Of course, he's threatening here to win a pawn by pawn to g5, but this is easily parried. So maybe if white played pawn to g5, would been better. Anyway, pawn to c4. Black now defended with bishop to e6. And now if white plays pawn to g5, black could play his knight back to e8. And now if we get exchanges off on d5, if all the pieces come off on d5, they'll be left with a black rook on d5 and a weak pawn at d3. This would be the net result of white's pawn to c4 move, that he's opened up the center against himself. So white really isn't looking too good here now because of this threat. Possibly white could play bishop to c3 instead of pawn to g5. Let's have the position back. Black knight on f6, white pawn on g4, black pawn on d5, black bishop on e6, white pawn on c4. White plays bishop to c3, or maybe black would have to play bishop e7. He still seems to be holding things okay. So put white's bishop back on d2, black bishop back on f8. Now, after bishop to e6, white now played his knight to h5. Black knight takes h5, white pawn takes h5. Black now played rook from c6 to d6, and white is now in serious pressure down the d file. White now tried queen to g3, trying another pin, which black broke quite simply by playing queen from c7 to d7. So white's in considerable trouble here. White played bishop to c3, and black just won a pawn. Pawn takes c4. White went bishop to g4. Black played pawn takes d3. White played pawn to h6. Now you might like to turn off the tape here and decide how you play for black. Black's two pawns up, but white has got some threats of attack in the position. So how should black counter it? Well, the one way black shouldn't counter it is to play pawn to g6, because then white plays queen to e5. and threatens mate on h8. And this, in fact, is white's only chance to get some play on this black diagonal with his bishop. Now, black needs to be able to keep his head and just withstand the attack. He can do this in probably several ways. Probably simplest is to play bishop takes g4. Now, after white plays pawn takes g7, you can either capture the pawn with bishop takes g7, and because in fact your pieces are so much better developed, if white plays bishop takes g7, king takes g7, pawn takes g4, you just play rook to g6. Another tactical idea is to, after white takes on g7, just to move your bishop to e7 and hide your king behind the e-pawn. In both cases, you have much the better position because, in fact, white's king is more exposed than black's in this position. And also black has got this very powerful pawn at d3. But the simplest way looks to be bishop takes g7, and white's position would have fallen to pieces. Anyway, you could say white scored a lucky win in this position, but probably not, because analysis shows that neither side particularly understood the underlying positional things going on. So this may help to clear them up.